Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dubcast with Dubside. I'm Andrew Zaga, and I'll be your host today, since Dubside's away this week. Today, it's my pleasure to be speaking with sea kayaker and skin boat designer and builder, Brian Schulz. Brian is founder of Cape Falcon Kayak and has been a multidisciplinary paddler for over 23 years and a full-time kayak builder for 17. Brian's been a regular speaker at Greenland Style events for years now and has also taught kayak building workshops all around the world. Welcome, Brian, and thanks for being on the show.
Hey, Andrew. Thanks for having me here.
So I think most people who have been involved in skin boats and Greenland Style probably are aware of you and what you do. For those who are not, I think a good place to start would be your 10-minute video titled Building a West Greenland Kayak Step by Step, which was published in December 2021. It's a beautiful video, and I think it really depicts best visually what you do. And now has over 4.2 million views, which is just really incredible. How did that video come together?
Well, that video particularly is just part of something that I like to do kind of in the normal workflow here, because a lot of what I do is just getting really granular into actually teaching course materials and designing boats. But a couple of years ago, we did an overview video that was just a visual flow through the entire kayak building process, just to give people a sense of how it's all going to come together. That way they know what the target is and what the basic steps are when they get into the detailed course material. It also was just kind of fun from an artistic standpoint, putting it together. And as I've made the switch from in-person teaching into video teaching and online teaching, we've had to really improve our videography skills. And so those projects just give a chance to increase that skill set. And the West Greenland one, I think, is the third one of these that we've done. The next one that I'm putting out is actually going to be one on building an East Greenland kayak. Really, as far as what it is on YouTube, it's just something I put out there just because I like making it from an artistic standpoint. I had no idea that it had 4 million views. I didn't know that it had more than 400,000 views or something like that. So that's really interesting to me.
It's such a pleasure to watch you work with wood, using saws and planes and steam bending ribs. The part I was blown away with was how it ended with you burning the Cape Falcon Kayak logo onto the frame.
Yeah, that almost feels kind of cheesy to me in a way, but it's from a videography standpoint, I think it's a nice way to end.
It was so beautifully photographed too. Probably we should give credit to your partner, Liz, for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Liz is the one that does all the filming. And as you know, as someone who's done a lot of video yourself, the technical side of this is so much more demanding than what you're actually trying to film. So I have a lot of appreciation for her. She does the filming, I do the editing, and then she does the color correction.
Very nice. How would you describe your working and creative relationship?
Oh, as far as my relationship with her, we both have different but very complementary skill sets. And so I built and taught skin on frame building full time for 17 years before I met Liz. We met about 6 years ago. And immediately at that time, I was thinking I wanted to try to transition what I was doing into an online teaching format because I was having some issues with my health that prevent me from teaching in person. And so I organized a class, and I had this deluded idea that I was just going to somehow get a videographer in the room with me. I was going to teach for a couple weeks, and then I was going to go home and edit for a few weeks, and then put out a paper plan set that was, 3 or 4 pages of instructions, and that was going to be fine. And I mean, I'm sure you're just laughing right now just hearing that. I had no idea the level of complexity and difficulty of what I was trying to do was. And fortunately, Liz was there to act as a sanity check. She has a background in graphic design and industrial design. Before we met, she actually previously had worked for a New York design firm. She's designed the interiors for several museums. She's also won several design awards as well. She's very, very design savvy and also computer savvy. And so as I was trying to turn this terribly filmed video that we made into a video course, and as I was teaching myself video editing, she was working in the background to try to turn our plan sets into something that looked a little more professional. And, looking back on it now, I I cringe to look at some of the original video material that we put out because it looks so amateurish. But I feel like we kind of had to start there because otherwise I never would have gotten into it if I would have known what it was going to take to get to the level that I'm at now with it. Anybody who's listening to this knows that video production is so much more demanding than you would think. So it's been really helpful to have her there. She designs all the Cape Falcon plan sets. I basically hand her huge piles of scribbles of notes, and then she turns them into the really, really professional looking plan sets that we put out. And then also, she's just instrumental in running the website. Our website is actually 5 websites that are woven together to look like one website. We've got multiple different payment platforms, different delivery platforms. She manages all that. She also manages and fills the orders for the retail side of things that we do. So if you get a kit from us, it's Liz that's putting together the pieces of your kayak building kit. And then on my side of things, I'm constantly answering student questions all day long. I'm getting texts from students who are building their own kayaks, and it's very much an interactive experience. I try to be as present with people as I would be in person. So if they can't find an answer in the video courses, they can just text me really quick and we can have a chat that way. And I've actually made a lot of really great friends that way as well. So while I'm doing that, and also while I'm designing kayaks, Liz is just managing the entire back end of the business as well. So I guess the short answer is that we work differently. We work very hard.
You're extremely lucky to have found such a talented partner to work with.
I am.
So how did you first get into Greenland style kayaking and traditional skin boat building?
Okay, so I have to really think about where I want to start this story because, I mean, there's roots in everything I've done here that go all the way back to when I started kayaking. So I think I'm going to start in the middle. Basically, I was a sea kayak instructor and also a whitewater kayaker as well in my early 20s. I was working for a shop. I was designing a new kayak instruction curriculum for them. And I was using the kayaks that were available to me on the Oregon coast in this tiny kayaking shop. And as I was designing the curriculum, I realized that a lot of the things that I was learning in these official trajectories through ACA and BCU training and also through books weren't actually working out very well when I would take those skills out onto the outer coast. It seemed to me that a lot of the skills that we were taught were important were really not that important. Certain aspects of the safety systems were overemphasized at the expense of other aspects, which I felt were much more important that weren't really focused on. And the boats themselves really weren't performing very well. I mean, when you take a sea kayak out through a 6-foot surf zone with 12-foot set waves and you're paddling all day long in 25 knot quartering winds and reflective waves off of sea cliffs, a lot of the sea kayak designs available at the time just paddled really poorly and were really frustrating and exhausting to paddle. That's kind of the backdrop of where I was. And a lot of my paddling style was really informed by my whitewater background. I don't like long sea kayaks. I don't like boats that are difficult to turn. I really like to play in rougher and more exciting conditions. And so, kind of against this backdrop, I was at the same time interested in building a sea kayak. And I don't know who listens to this podcast, but it's kind of interesting that the first sea kayak I tried to build was actually the Guillemot out of Nick Shada's book. So I built the strong back for the Guillemot, and it sat in my living room for 2 years without a single strip of wood on it. And I just felt guiltier and guiltier about it until finally I cut the form up. And I just always had this nagging thing in the back of my mind where I just felt bad about myself because I was thinking to myself, man, I can't even build a kayak. Like, what good am I? I had this kind of guilt of not being able to complete the kayak. And I met a person who was trying to build an Aleutian kayak out of Wolfgang Brink's book in her basement. And it seemed like an interesting project. And so we started talking and became friends. And I looked at what she was doing and I was like, oh, this doesn't seem very hard at all. I think we can finish this. So over the next month, we finished that Aleutian kayak. It weighed about 50 pounds. It paddled absolutely horribly. But having done it, I was like, that wasn't that hard. I bet you I could do better if I built another one. So still working from Wolfgang's book, I built another kayak. And that one took me 2 weeks and it still paddled pretty terribly. And then I was like, everybody's telling me that these Arctic kayaks are these amazing paddling boats. I must be doing something wrong. So I built another one in another 2 weeks, and that one paddled really terribly as well. I felt like if I just kept at it, I could probably build a boat that I like to paddle. So I built a couple more Aleutian kayaks the next month. This was in the winter. I wasn't working at the time. And at the end of building 5 Aleutian kayaks, I built one that I thought paddled pretty decently. It still wasn't exactly what I wanted, and it certainly wasn't the right boat for the kind of offshore paddling I like to do, but it was an interesting thing. And I then turned to Greenland kayaks using the same materials that were available at the time, which a lot of people were building from, which was the book by Robert Morris and the book by Christopher Cunningham. And I built a couple boats from Robert Morris's book. I built a couple boats from Chris Cunningham's book, and I really didn't like either of those. I didn't like how they paddled, and I think this kind of speaks to the kind of obsessive personality that I am, because I think if most people had built 10 kayaks without finding one they liked, they probably wouldn't build skin on frame kayaks anymore. But I just felt like there had to be something I was missing, because Arctic people use these as their primary hunting and survival craft for centuries. So if I was having a problem with the boats, it was clearly a problem with the boats, or a problem with me. So it was right about that time that I just really fortunately happened to be walking in a neighborhood near my house, and I saw all these Arctic kayaks hanging from a ceiling inside of this big white house on a corner that looked like it used to be an old store. I would go by there, and I didn't know who lived there, so I would actually climb up onto the windowsill and look in like a creeper, and and I would look at all these Arctic kayaks, and I wanted to know who this person was. And no, I didn't actually meet them that way. I guess I should have just knocked on the door. But a friend of mine mentioned who this person was and offered me an introduction. And that's when I met Harvey Golden, who is, I guess you could say, he's the world's eminent kayak historian. There's not a lot of guys really out there that are doing that sort of work. And at the time, Harvey had been traveling for, this would have been in early 2001. And so Harvey had already been doing this work for 4 or 5 years, traveling all over the world and surveying historic kayaks and
And
reproducing
he
them.
had just competed in the Greenland kayaking
Correct,
championships.
correct. He had. Harvey was actually a very good kayak roller, much better than I have ever been. So I met Harvey, and he was pretty casual. He's really easygoing guy, and asked me kind of what I was doing, and he's like, "Yeah, I hear you built some kayaks." I'm like, "Yeah," and I could see that I could see that he'd been through this before with people, where somebody tells him about the kayak they build, and he has a brief, polite conversation, and then goes on with things. And then he said, "How many have you made?" And I'm like, I think I've made about 7." And he said, "In how long?" And I'm like, 3 months." And that's when he kind of perked up, and he was like, "Why don't you come inside and look at some of my kayaks?" So I went to Harv's house, and I started to look at his kayaks, and that's when my understanding and my experience with skin on frame boats really started to expand, because I realized that the materials that we were being presented with in the Wolfgang Brink Aleutian Kayak book, the Robert Morris Building Skin on Frame Kayaks book, and the Christopher Cunningham Building the Greenland Kayak book were just a very tiny, tiny slice of Arctic kayaks. And they weren't really representing the diversity or the complexity of the boats. And in some cases, there were even things that weren't 100% accurate, which isn't like a criticism. It just has to do with the information that those men were working from at the time. And so I started building kayaks from some of Harvey's survey notes, which weren't available at the time. He hadn't published any books. And I started building a couple different replicas of Greenland kayaks. And I think I also built another Aleutian kayak replica as well. And I still didn't like paddling them. I didn't feel like they were the correct kayak for the kind of things I was doing with kind of aggressive offshore coastal surf paddling. But they meant so much more to me. The fact that they were actually built according to historic lines, they just had this really deep historic richness to them. They were more complicated, they were more beautiful, they were more intriguing. And something that you see in some of the books that purport to tell you how to build Arctic kayaks is they tell you how to modify them for your own uses. And I'm very, very skeptical of that, because we are very different in body size often than traditional Inuit paddlers, and we have very different paddling objectives. And I feel like if you take an Arctic kayak and then start modifying it, you end up with something that doesn't have a lot of historical value, but still probably isn't going to meet your own paddling objectives or your body size. So I felt like for me, I needed to go in a totally different direction. I loved the historic replicas I was building, which is work that I continue to do to this day. But I realized that if I want a kayak for the kind of boating that I want to do, why am I looking at historic kayaks? Why don't I take this super easy, fun, flexible building medium and start using it to design modern kayaks? And so I came up with an idea and I put it down on paper and I built it and it sucked and it paddled like crap. And then I came up with a couple more. And then about 5 boats later, I built a boat that I actually really liked paddling offshore. And it was a very ugly boat. I mean, by every stretch of the imagination, it was horrible looking. That boat was called the Giniac. It was 14 foot 8 inches long, I believe, and 21.5 inches wide. It was 7 inches deep. And so it was very low volume, kind of like about the same volume as a Greenland kayak, but it was a dramatically Swede form hull shape with the paddler sitting very far back. And that particular hull shape naturally resists weathercocking. And also it surfs a lot better as well, which are two things that are absolutely critical for the kind of paddling I like to do. And so that was the boat that I built for a while. And I want to talk more about kind of where that evolved into with my modern design work and my teaching.
Well,
I
actually,
kind of,
let me interrupt you first
mhm,
because I wanted to
mhm.
address this issue. So it's often stated by Greenland style enthusiasts that traditional kayaks are the end product of thousands of years of evolution. So the designs have reached a state of near perfection. What do you think of that statement?
So that's actually kind of a hard question to answer because I feel like as a modern paddler, I am so far removed from the traditional Inuit hunting context that I don't even have a frame of reference to make a value judgment there. For example, asking someone who's a recreational sea kayaker to think about whether or not a traditional Inuit hunting kayak is a good kayak or not would be like handing a sea kayak to someone who's only done whitewater kayaking and asking them if it's a good sea kayak. I mean, you just don't really have enough information to even begin to think about the question. And there are actually still people that do hunt out of kayaks, very few of them around the world. But even those people would have pretty limited perspective because how you hunt out of your kayak is influenced by how your kayak is built. And just to kind of think about that a little bit further, if you were to imagine putting a East Greenland kayak hunter in a Baffin Bay kayak and asking them if it was a good hunting kayak, they would probably tell you it was a terrible hunting kayak. And if you were to put an Aleutian kayaker in an East Greenland kayak and ask them if it was a good hunting kayak, they would also tell you it was a terrible hunting kayak. And so it's one of those things where the kayak designs and the hunting methods evolved simultaneously in all these different places across the Arctic. And that led to this huge divergence of different types of kayaks and also different methods of kayak hunting. And I think that actually tells us something really important about evolution, and that is that evolution doesn't necessarily select for the best answer for any given situation. It just selects for an answer that's not going to die out into the next generation. I guess if we were to kind of extrapolate to every other area of human technology, we can probably assume that some of these kayaks were very highly refined and were probably as good as they could be for the task. And others of these kayaks probably could have been a lot better. And the people that used them just found ways to make them work. And then just to add one more layer of complexity to that, there's also no evidence that the existing Arctic kayaks that we know of that are in museums are representational of the best of their paddling kayaks. And it's not hard to visualize a situation where you might have a European explorer coming through a village looking for a kayak to bring back. And if you were a kayak hunter there, would you give that person your best hunting kayak, or would you give them one that maybe might not be your best hunting kayak? And I'm not saying that that's true or not true. I'm just saying it's something to think about. And that's one of the reasons that in my own work, what I try to do is, in addition to just building exact copies of traditional Arctic hunting kayaks, I also will sometimes mix and match features, not from different cultural groups or different time periods, but from different collected examples from the same cultural group in the same time period to create things that aren't a copy of any specific museum kayak, but have features from different kayaks from that time period. But even there, I'm really not sure how much you can actually learn because, once again, as a modern paddler, I can't design a kayak that's good for seal hunting. I can just tell you how good it is for the type of paddling that we like to do. Whenever we think about traditional Arctic kayaks, it's just a matter of considering the context. These may not have been the best paddling examples. We may not be building them right today. Very, very often when I see people reproducing traditional Arctic kayaks, they're doing things that were never done on traditional Arctic kayaks. And they will show up with a boat and be like, this is my Greenland kayak, but it has a proportion or a feature or a design balance that was never Greenland. You can't really draw any conjecture about how something paddled if you're not building it correctly. And then there's one final thing that people sometimes don't take into account, and that's the issue of scale. So just taking one ethnographic survey from the 1950s, the average East Greenland kayak hunter was 5'5" tall and 145 pounds. Granted, that person's kayak was probably about 10 pounds heavier than what we build today, just because of how it would have been built. And they would have had another 10 pounds of hunting gear on deck. And so functionally, if you want to do an apples to apples comparison of a traditional Greenland kayak hunter to a modern person in a similar Greenland kayak, that would be about a 160-pound person, which is about the weight that I am personally. If you're someone that is much larger than that or much smaller than that, but you're building a boat the same size, it's not going to feel the same to you on the water as the original boat would have. And so a big part of my work lately has been making the Arctic kayak designs that I offer scalable. So someone of a different size can have the same paddling experience on the water as the original person would. The question that people will have often when I mention that is they say, well, yeah, but what about anthropomorphic scaling? I mean, I looked in the Morris and the Cunningham book, and they say that I can just take the length of my elbow plus my hand plus 2 times my height or something, and I can get the right size boat for me. And this is a subject I have very strong opinions on. I don't expect everyone to agree with me, and I don't want anyone to think when I say things passionately that I think that I'm necessarily always right about things. But my opinion is this, and that is anthropometric scaling systems that require body measurements were never uniform throughout Arctic kayaking. And I'm not saying that there wasn't a system, because H.C. Peterson, in his book on building the Greenland kayak, which is the historic text that the Morris and Cunningham books are sort of loosely based on, he gives a system that actually was grounded in history, but that is a narrow slice of history. That's one group of people in one location. And also it was people with a very homogeneous body size. There's no historic evidence that what they did in Southwest Greenland in 1920 is what they did in Northwest Greenland in 1840 or in East Greenland in 1700. These systems were never static. And there tends to be this lore that gets entrenched in people, I think largely through people regurgitating things other people are saying in internet forums about the way that these things were done that don't really work. Because if you are a 5'4" person, but you're 210 pounds, and you try to build a Greenland kayak off of your arm span and your body measurements, you're obviously going to end up in a kayak that's way too small for you. Or if you're an extremely tall, thin person, you're going to end up in a kayak that's 22 feet long and is way too big for you. And so the approach that I've taken recently is to start with 155 to 160 pounds as the basic size, and assume that the collected examples that we see, at least with Greenland kayaks, were piloted by a hunter and hunting gear combination that was about that same displacement. And then I proportionately scale the boats up and down in 1% increments to give a size range of boats that can be accurately fitted to paddlers from 110 all the way up to 210 pounds. And I think that's a much better approach to modern sized paddlers getting to actually feel what these boats felt like on the water in a way that's probably a little bit more accurate, I guess you could say.
So you can't just proportionally increase the size of the boat based on someone's anthropomorphic measurements. How would you decide how you proportionally increase certain dimensions?
It's just simply a matter of displacement. I haven't worked this out with a hull design program because I'm not a computer designer, but essentially what I look for is for people to proportionately have the same amount of freeboard as what was seen historically for that type. For example, the kayak that I focus on the most, this is not my modern work, but the historic kayak that I focus on the most is early 20th century West Greenland rifle hunting kayaks of middle to southwest Greenland, because that's the type of kayak that there is the most historic support for. And so it's easier to average the results of all the different types in museums to get a sense of how the kayaks were really built and also a sense of the variation. There's just the most historic support. And then also, there's going to be the most historic photos of those because the camera was invented at that point and we can see how people were sitting on the water. When I look at historic images from those paddlers in those time periods, I see freeboard on the side of the boat from the gunnel down to the water line in the middle of the boat that was usually ranging between 2 to 3.5 inches, and I would say 2.5 inches might be considered an average on that. So that's kind of what I'm targeting. Now, of course, as someone gets smaller, everything gets smaller. So that for a 110-pound person, that 2 inches that 2.5 might shrink to 2 inches of freeboard. And for a 210-pound person, that might increase from 2.5 to 3 inches of freeboard. And I know that these sound, for people not familiar with kayak design, these sound like minor differences. But when you're talking about displacement, it's important to remember that we're discussing spherical volumes here. And so very small changes in scale can create very large differences in displacement. For example, my 110-pound West Greenland kayak is scaled down 5% from my 165-pound one, and my 210-pound West Greenland kayak is scaled up 5%. And everything in that size range from 5% below to 5% up will yield roughly the same amount of freeboard on the side of the kayak and hopefully the same paddling performance, quite honestly, because I feel like very large paddlers really miss out on the traditional Arctic kayak experience because there's no good instructions for how to size these boats to those people. And so sometimes you'll see very big people cramming themselves into undersized Greenland kayaks, and that might be good for rolling, but it's certainly not going to be a good boat to paddle. It's something that I'm still learning, quite honestly.
Well, I
Yeah.
mean, you must be the most prolific builder in the world as far as skin on frame kayaks and boats go. How many boats do you think you've built?
Not a ton personally. I mean, let me think for a sec. If I've been doing this for about 22 years, I've probably built maybe on average 7 or 8 boats a year personally. So I don't know, a couple hundred, not a lot. But I do have the advantage of being an instructor in that I have facilitated people building probably over 2,000 skin boats. And that is something that I'm eternally grateful for, Andrew, because there's no way that I could have learned the things that I know now just building a couple hundred skin boats. It's just not enough. Like if you there's things that you start to understand that you only start to understand when you get into very high levels of iteration. And that's kind of where I'm at right now, I mean, and I'm always learning. It surprises me that for something as simple as a skin boat, and skin boats are very simple. I mean, we're not building rocket ships here. It's just some sticks that are tied together that we sew some fabric over. It's not hard. Anybody can do it.
Well,
But
yeah,
like,
building it uses simple techniques, but the design decisions I find are the most difficult part. Like the simple question of where you put the cockpit to get the proper trim.
yeah,
That's something I still don't understand. Maybe you could explain it
it's
to me.
and it's something that is completely in relationship to the rest of the volume of the boat. I mean, there's no simple answer to anything because every decision affects every other decision, and there's a surprising amount of nuance to it. I mean, in ways that I personally didn't understand even until recently. Most of my career has been focused on trying to design good modern kayaks in skin on frames. Not focusing so much on the historic Inuit side of things, but trying to see if I can use the skin on frame medium to create boats that paddle as well as modern sea kayaks. Because for me, the reason I got into it is I didn't have the money to buy a good modern sea kayak, and I didn't like how any of the sea kayaks that were being designed at the time paddled. And so I just seemed natural to me to try to take this really easy way to build a boat and see if I could make a good boat. On the modern side of things, I really have gained an appreciation for the nuance of shaping. Little changes can make a big difference in proportion. But on the historic side of things, I think I almost gave up too early. I started building the conjectural Greenland kayaks that you would build from the Cunningham and the Morris book, and they just didn't excite me. I mean, I'm not saying anything bad about either of those boats
Did
at
you
all,
ever
or either of those people.
did you ever talk with or speak with Robert Morris or Chris Cunningham about
Yeah,
their books?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, not so much about the process of them. I know both men. I like both men very well. And I really have a deep appreciation for their contribution and the work that they did. I didn't discuss so much their experience in creating the books because by the time that I was talking to them, I was already really deep into my own trajectory with skin on frame. Everything changes. I mean, in 20 years, there will be people that look back on what I did as being fairly simple, and probably things that I think are totally correct now are going to turn out to be misguided or whatever. And so design is just evolution, and there's no right or wrong. There's just wherever you are in the chain of what you're working on. I know a lot of people that have built kayaks from both of those books that they're very happy with, and I think both of those guys have made incredible contributions to skin on frame. The more the merrier.
Another name that
Mhm.
comes to mind is Corey Freedman, who
Yeah.
exclusively builds the Aleut style kayak, the Badarka.
Yes.
You got to know him.
Yeah.
Was he pretty open about sharing his knowledge of the skin coatings with you?
Yeah. Corey, I like Corey a lot. He's a bit of an eccentric character, and I'm sure a lot of people would say that about myself as well. And I've really appreciated his approach to skin boats over the years because he is both a bit of a maverick in skin boat design, but also very much a traditionalist. And the thing I appreciate the most about Corey is that he takes his craft very seriously. Corey, like me, would build a boat 100 times over if he didn't think it was right. And even though there are aspects of his traditional kayaks that are not exactly traditional. For example, his hull shapes are a little bit more full than the actual Aleut kayaks were in most cases. And also, he has trimmed the paddler backwards a little bit as well. And both of these things make a massive difference in how well that boat paddles. And so, if you were to take a truly perfectly authentic historic Aleut kayak and put it on the water next to one of Corey's slightly modified Aleut kayaks, his kayak would be so much more tolerable for modern paddlers. So, from a design point of view, what he's doing is he's taking a historic craft that wasn't very user friendly and making it a craft that people actually want to paddle, which is pretty important if you want to preserve a tradition, even if you're changing it a little. But what I appreciate about him at the same time is that he hasn't gone the direction that I see so many builders doing. And what they'll do is they'll take the complexity of Inuit kayaks and they will start to diminish it because they want to make it easier to build or they want to make it simpler. And in some cases, Corey has even increased the complexity of his kayaks. He doesn't cut corners. The boats are as light as they can be. They're extremely strong. He really has just a deep integrity as far as the quality of the boats. And like myself, he's also a person of pretty strong opinions as well. So I've always really appreciated what Corey has done for skin boats. He's been around for longer than anyone has, really, except for maybe George Dyson. I think I've probably put more skin boats on the water than he has at this point, but I mean, it would be a close tie.
You know what? One of his biggest contributions is his two-part polyurethane,
Yes.
otherwise known as Corey's Goop. I've heard of instances where he caught students trying to find his source for this special goop. You use that, don't you?
I do. And I would say, quite honestly, if it wasn't for Corey and his Goop, I wouldn't be a skin boat builder. And the reason is when I first started building these, I would cover them with whatever cloth I could find. and then I would put whatever varnish I could find on them, and the skin would get saggy, and it also wasn't very durable. I'm not out just kind of messing around on the local pond. Oftentimes, the places that I used to paddle, you would have to paddle literally for 15 miles to get to somewhere you could even land. So if you had a skin failure, you would just die from that. I couldn't I couldn't have skin boats performing poorly out in the conditions that I paddled in. Corey's two-part polyurethane combined with his particular nylon gave me a boat that was nice and lightweight, but it was something that could handle the abuse of serious coastal paddling. In 20 years of being a coastal paddler, well, actually only 15 years that I was paddling. I'm not paddling these days, but in the years that I was an aggressive coastal paddler, I have never come close to putting a hole in one of the boats that I had. And that very much has to do with the two-part polyurethane and nylon, because nylon is an elastic fiber, which is one of the reasons it used to be used in bulletproof vests. And also the two-part polyurethane is elastic as well. And those two things combined give the skin an incredible ability to absorb impacts. Like, I can't tell you how many times that I have been surfed sideways into a rock and just immediately thought to myself from how hard I hit that I was going to sink in minutes. And I get out and the skin is just scratched. It's not even punctured. So I'm really appreciative for that. It's not the only option out there, though. What Corey uses, and he protects his source pretty carefully, and people shouldn't try to find the source for that because it's a personal contact of his. He's not reselling it from a major company. You will never be able to do an end run around him to get that polyurethane. And also, there'd be no reason to. If you're serious about it, just have a manufacturer make it for you in the way that he does. Order 1,000 gallons at a time of two-part polyurethane. Like, somebody else can get into this game if you want to, have somebody make you thousands of gallons of polyurethane. But if you don't want to do what he's doing, you could also use what's called an aliphatic two-part polyurethane. And that's the substance that's commonly known as Coalan. Coalan is actually, I believe, a superior coating. It's much less prone to UV degradation. It probably has a longer lifespan, but it is also massively more toxic and also massively more expensive. And so I feel like the two-part that Corey sells is probably the best value threshold for a skin boat.
If Corey should suddenly keel over one day, would you still be able to get it?
Oh my God. Corey, I hope you're listening to this podcast. You have to leave a note for me personally about where I can get this stuff, because
that could be a serious problem.
Because if you ever keel over for some reason, like, nobody's going to be able to get it. And I should probably be the person that sells it, not because I want the profit for that. I don't really care about being a skin boat supplier, but I just think I would be a good central person to be able to distribute that to people, because all my students buy it from him directly. So hopefully, the answer is hopefully.
Did you ever get any kayak building tips from Greenlanders like Muligiak?
Not so much. I think one of the consequences of the Greenland hunting tradition being broken was that the Greenlanders, much like everyone else, were at the time that I started building, having to relearn the best way to build their own boats, And I mean, that's I'm not making any value judgments there at all. I mean, it's just a fact. Hunting through Greenland kayaks was how they survived for centuries. But then when they were exposed to the internal combustion engine and the ability to hunt out of motorboats, it only took a generation for kayaks to almost completely vanish. There were always kayaks hanging on in Greenland. I mean, it was not a completely broken tradition, but the knowledge was lost for the most part. And so Greenlanders, like everyone else, working from their own trial and error in Greenland, and then also from their own museum examples, have been piecing back together their kayak history. And, Muligiak's a great example of that. Muligiak is an extraordinarily talented paddler, but I don't think he had access to really good building information in the beginning. And so the kayaks reflected that. But if you look at the kayaks that Muligiak builds now, I recently saw one and I was completely shocked at how good it was. So I've never really had a lot of contact with Greenlanders. I have not traveled to Greenland, although I probably will be soon. And also, I've been mostly focused on modern skin-on-frame design. And so there's not a lot about traditional boats that relates to a lot of what I do in some ways. So I think the most enlightening discussions I've had with Greenlanders was actually just talking about hunting. I think this has changed somewhat. You would know this more than myself, but when I got into traditional Arctic kayaking, it was almost exclusively focused on Greenland rolling. And there's no problem with that. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, there's no point in centering a modern kayak culture around hunting seals in America because nobody's hunting seals. But that's mostly what people were interested in. And that was really driving the evolution of the boats in a way that was good for rolling and not good for much else. So, as someone who was more interested in the paddling side of things, I was always reproducing Arctic kayaks and taking them out paddling. I would take them out in coastal conditions. I would take them on long trips. And I was really interested in the hunting aspect. And one of the people that I had the opportunity to correspond with somewhat extensively is John Peterson, who's a Greenland kayaker. I haven't spoken to him for many years now. And one of the remaining people that still hunts seals from a kayak in West Greenland. And we would talk a lot about design and shaping and performance in that context, not just in the competition rolling context. And one of the themes that emerged from those discussions, both with him and then also through conversations that friends of mine have had with other Greenlanders, is that it may not be clear to us, but it's clear to them that most Greenland kayaks in America are built too small for the people that are paddling them. I have an anecdote about that. Specifically, a friend of mine asked through a translator at a kayaking event here in the States to a group of Greenlanders, what do you think about this whole thing being over here and seeing these Americans in all these kayaks? And I think he was fishing for a much more complicated answer, but the answer he got was, we don't understand why you guys are building kayaks that you don't fit into. And so, I have gotten some information there. It's just, I don't think the information that most people are interested in. And that's really more to do with the paddling and hunting side of things and less to do with the rolling.
Interesting that you mentioned John Peterson because he had an article in the latest issue of the Massac.
Really?
Yeah. It's on the hunt in Thule where he hunts narwhal with these kayakers that are still hunting from kayaks. One thing that he says in this article is that the kayaks are only launched when optimal conditions are present, i.e. no wind and no waves. Those are the kind of conditions that those kayaks are made for.
Yeah, well, especially the Thule kayaks because they're not rolling kayaks. And so you have to be much more careful. I mean, I think that the South and West Greenland and East Greenland kayaks, probably went out in worse conditions. But if you have nothing but bearskin pants on and a sealskin jacket, you're not going to take any risks that you don't have to. And I mean, of course, they were caught out in storms. If you were starving, you probably went out in a storm to try to get food because you needed to eat. But I mean, you wouldn't choose to do it on purpose. That's really interesting because I haven't spoken to John for at least 10 years. And it was a relationship I was hoping to continue. Before I started having health issues, I was hoping to come over there and actually to go hunting with him, but it just wasn't something that ever materialized. So I'm really glad that he's still involved. And I really appreciate the limited discussions that we had.
Well, talking about rolling, how did you first meet Dubside?
Okay, yeah. So I'm going to back up a little bit and then I'll kind of lead into that. So basically, I'm someone that probably never would have gotten into Greenland rolling. The reason that I got into Greenland rolling is I was in my early 20s, a really pretty aggressive whitewater kayaker, and also I was a board surfer as well. And I, as many young men do, I got out onto a wave that was, above my skill level and ended up not making the wave and got thrown onto a reef and really badly damaged my shoulder. And so after that, I wasn't able to paddle. I wasn't able to go out whitewater kayaking. I couldn't do my coastal sea kayaking anymore. And it was just a really difficult time for me because, I was in my early 20s. I was young. I was aggressive. I was fit. All I wanted to do was paddle. And suddenly I couldn't paddle. And this was right at the same time that I was first starting to build skin boats. So along with building skin boats, I got exposed to the Greenland paddle. At that time, regardless of what paddle I was paddling with, whether it was a Euro paddle or a Greenland paddle, I could only paddle for about 20 minutes and then I would have to ice my shoulder for 2 days. And that went on for over a year. But what I realized was that if I went out with the Greenland paddle, I could paddle for longer because it has less of a bite on the water. And so I would go out paddling with the Greenland paddle. And one of the things that's underappreciated about Greenland paddles is the kind of slight flutter that they have that you kind of have to work around and control is activating the smaller muscle groups of your rotator cuff. If you're paddling with a European style paddle, you're activating a lot of the larger muscle groups in your shoulder while you're taking strokes. If you want to rehab a shoulder injury, the idea is to do more repetition with less force. So you're really building up the strength in those smaller rotator cuff muscles and really tightening up the shoulder and allowing it to heal itself. I didn't start paddling with a Greenland paddle because I thought Greenland paddles were good. In fact, at the time, I thought they were bad. And I was out paddling alone and nobody would paddle with me because I was paddled very slow and I couldn't keep up with anyone. So my attitude about a Greenland paddle was, okay, I'm going to paddle with this crappy little stick, but at least I can paddle. At least I'm out on the water and my shoulder doesn't hurt as much. And it's actually kind of funny, Andrew, because it wasn't until 2 years later when my shoulder got strong enough that I went out with a Greenland paddle and people with European paddles, and I wasn't going any slower. And I realized that my perception that Greenland paddles were slower was solely coming from how it subjectively felt to me. I was so sure that Greenland paddles were slower that I never bothered to put a GPS on it. So when I got back to paddling with other people, it was amazing. I was like, wait a minute, I'm not working very hard. My shoulders are strong. I am less prone to shoulder injury when I'm paddling with this paddle, and I'm going just as fast as everybody else is, and I'm not even working as hard. And there's no true efficiency increase of a Greenland paddle over a European paddle, and a wing paddle in competent hands will beat both of those slightly, although it has many other disadvantages. It was really a revelation to slowly come into this. Like a lot of people get into it based on dogma and lore, and I feel like I kind of went into it the other way. Like I came into it convinced it wasn't really that interesting, and slowly it grew on me. And the same thing was happening with the rolling. Like for me, before that, a roll was a means to an end. I was rolling my sea kayak because I didn't want to drown in whitewater. And my role was very simple. I would set up and I would get in the setup position, do everything they tell you to do, and I'd fire off a roll and it would work or it didn't work. And it was a very intense thing. Like rolling was like every time you're upside down, you have fear, your adrenaline's going, and then you're trying to get in your setup position, and then you're firing off the hardest roll that you need to. And sometimes it barely makes it, and it's a very high stakes game. And then because my shoulder was damaged, I didn't know what to do with myself. Like none of my whitewater friends would go out paddling with me. None of my hardcore like sea kayak friends would go out paddling with me because I couldn't paddle. So where did I end up? I ended up in the Greenland kayaking community. So I went to sticks, I went to different events, and I started getting to know traditional kayaking people because they were people that I could just hang out with, and it was a branch of the sport that I could still be part of. Even with my really badly damaged shoulder, I would start learning these roles. It gave me a community. There's lots of great friends that I met, and I started to develop this skill set. And I've never been a great roller. I mean, I'm a good roller, but I'm never, ever going to be a great roller. I can do probably 2/3 of the competition rolls. It was a diversion for me. It was always something that I thought of as something to do until I could get back to whitewater paddling, quite honestly. And then as I spent more time with it, I started to appreciate it as its own branch of the sport. And so I'm really appreciative that I had the shoulder injury because otherwise I probably wouldn't have ended up in the traditional paddling community. And I would say that traditional paddling, not just the building side of things, but just the paddling side of things, has had more of an impact on every other branch of the sport that I practice than anything else. I don't know exactly when, but sometime in there, I met Dubside. It could have been at Styx. It could have been at Delmarva, one of these paddling events that we have. And I like Dubside a lot because I like people that are outside of the mold, and Dubside is unique in that he has this extraordinary traditional paddling skill set, but he doesn't feel like you have to be in a Greenland boat to utilize that skill set. I mean, he always carried around that folding kayak, the Featherlight Whisper, and he would compete in that. And I mean, Dubside, I loved him as kind of very much one of the heads of our sport, at least here in America, because here was a guy that was proof that you don't need to be in an ultra low volume kayak that is so low volume that you can't even paddle it very well to really have an advanced Greenland rolling set. And he's also, I also just love Dubside, like, because he's a humble dude. He's not a self promoter. He's not someone who thinks he's the shit or anything like that. He's just a guy that likes to paddle, that is passionate about things. And something else I appreciate about him that I will never do is that he took a really strong interest in Greenland culture. Dubside can speak a decent amount of Greenlandic words. He's an expert on Greenland ropes courses. His involvement in Greenland paddling is so much more than just a rolling skill set. It's a lot more well-rounded. And I think that's important to have examples of that, because the thing that I personally don't want to see, and the thing I feel like we're moving away from, I hope, is I don't want all that survives of Greenland kayaking to be the rolling culture. I want it to be more than that. So yeah, I like the upside a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, he definitely has a deep respect for the culture and tries to give back to the Greenlanders as much as he
Yeah.
can. Well, you've done a lot of rolling instruction yourself. What advice would you give for people who want to learn how to roll?
Oh man. I should probably take a second and try to structure this answer mentally. So the most important piece of advice, and I don't know, see, here's what I want to tell people, Andrew, isn't terribly useful to people right now because I can't direct anyone to resources for this. But assuming that resources existed, I would tell people, don't worry about learning how to roll. Learn how the brain learns, because rolling itself is an utterly simple thing. All you're doing is reaching up and grabbing a little chunk of water. That could be your hand grabbing the surface of the water. That could be your paddle grabbing the surface of the water. That could be you holding onto a float. And then you're also just turning the boat over with your hips. Anybody can do it. Someone who is old and infirm with almost no body strength at all and no flexibility could easily roll a kayak if we are just talking about the mechanical side of things. If you're just talking about the mechanical side of things, rolling is utterly simple and it takes almost no effort. And so the next question you're going to have is, if that's true, Brian, then why do so many people have so much trouble with it? The problem is your brain and how you're wired by evolution. Basically, we are land mammals and we are designed to survive. So anything that triggers our core panic responses is going to immediately put our body into a stance where we tighten up at the waist. And so the two things that happen if you get pushed sideways, like let's say you fall over right now. If you just take your body, stand up and start falling sideways, what is your natural instinct? It's going to be to reach out to try to grab something. And also you're going to tighten up at the waist. Both of those things that are triggered by the automatic fear response in your brainstem to a perceived threat are the opposite of what you need to do to successfully roll a kayak. So in a kayak, if you start falling into the water, you need to automatically push your body down into the water further and you will come up really easily. So what tends to happen, at least the way what I see with people, is people will go through a rolling trajectory and they will, with sometimes better, sometimes worse results, just depending on their own aptitudes and the aptitude of the instructor. They might get a roll that's kind of shaky, but they're working really hard. So when you see someone in a pool that's just firing off these rolls and you can see that they're just slamming their rolls, but they're barely coming up, what's happening there doesn't necessarily have to do with technique. And the reason we know this is because you can easily roll a kayak just with your hand if you have good technique. And so it's not the mechanical thing that's going wrong with what they're doing. What you're not seeing is that while they're doing the correct motion, technically, their brainstem is activating all the muscles in the core of their body and tensing them up. And so they are fighting the tension of their own waist to turn the kayak over. And this is what makes traditional Greenland rolling such an amazing thing. And this is kind of where I was wanting to get to anyways, because the only way to circumvent that natural response to five core evolutionary hardwired fears: fear of being upside down, fear of being trapped from the waist down, fear of water going up your nose, fear of the dark, and fear of cold. Those are 5 things that are going to slice right through your cortex down into your brainstem and are going to trigger panic and tension. And the only way to unwire those natural responses is to spend a heck of a lot of time under the water. And if you just go to regular sea kayak practice once in a while, every 2 weeks, you go to a roll session, if you're motivated and you have access to that, it's just not enough to break down those neurological connections and rewire them in the correct way. And so even if someone learns good rolling technique, they're always working really hard against themselves because they still have so much core tension activated by those natural fears. So that's one part of the problem. The other part of the problem is how people learn. So learning how to retrain your brainstem is a game of chutes and ladders. It's not like learning cognitive skills. You're having to slowly coax your very stupid, evolutionarily programmed brainstem into a new pattern of action. And that is only going to rewire itself at the speed it's going to rewire itself. Let's say you're doing a rolling session. The most important piece of advice that I have with people is stop when you notice you're getting worse. So let's say you're working with an instructor on doing your hip snaps or doing your sweep or something like that. There's going to be one point in your training session at which you start to do a worse motion. And the important thing to know when you're trying to retrain automatic instinctive skills that aren't cognitive but need to be wired into your instinctive response is that every time you do a repetition wrong, you are teaching your brainstem to do it wrong. And so if I go out and I do 20 repetitions right, but then I'm tired, but I just want to keep practicing, and so I start doing it wrong, every single one of those that I do wrong is canceling one of the ones that I did it right. And so it's very much a numbers game in your brainstem of only letting your brain have correct repetitions. And I think people could learn so much faster if they just learn to stop the moment they notice they're getting worse. And then the other thing is frequency is very critical. There's an optimal frequency to learn rolling, and it changes depending on your own body and also as we age. You have to let your hip muscles recover for the right amount of time. But other than that, other than the physical recovery time, you want to increase your frequency as much as possible. And I'm going to give you a perfect example here of how not to learn to roll. And that is how I am currently learning the Spanish language. I've always wanted to learn Spanish. And so I decided that this last year I was finally going to do it. I've put in about 400 hours into learning Spanish at this point. I practice 1 hour per day. And I will know it. I will be able to speak in a couple of years, but my progression is slow because if you really want to learn something, you have to get ahead of the forgetting window, and you have to use it more often. And so what I like to tell people as far as their practice schedule for rolling is that if you're really serious about learning to roll and learning to roll well, first understand how the brain works so you can work with your brain so it will learn as easily as possible. Don't keep pushing when you're already tired. And then try to block out a section of your life where you can condense your rolling practice to 2 to 3 times a week for 2 months. Because if you can get on the water practicing rolling with a good system, not a bad system, if you're training wrong, it's not going to work. But if you've got a good system for your rolling training, and there are several different systems that work really well, and you can do it 2 to 3 times a week, and you can do that for 3 months, you will have a roll that will never, ever fail you in real life again. Conversely, if you take that same amount of practice and you spread it out over 2 years, just going to a pool session once a month, you're still going to have a shaky roll and you're never going to get over that hump. And, a lot of people will say, oh, well, that's a big commitment, Brian. I don't really want to do that. I don't have time for that. And, I just have to say that you have to compare it to anything else you'd put effort into your life. And what you're talking about is the same amount of effort that you would put into completing a 3-credit college class, which I think most of us can probably do. So it's just a matter of prioritizing. Get a good system, understand how your brain works, and then really prioritize the frequency within the physiological window that your body can handle it. And your roll will happen so much quicker and it will be so much more solid.
This episode of the Dubcast with Dubside has been broken into 2 parts, and this concludes part 1 of my interview with Brian Schulz. In part 2, we talk more about the psychology of rolling, how learning Greenland techniques can help paddlers develop better focus and deal with fear and anxiety, how a low-volume sea kayak can be the worst thing for learning how to roll, and how a paddling progression acquired over years can be erased in seconds by a traumatic experience. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to Brian's website, Cape Falcon Kayak, and the Building the West Greenland Kayak video.